HOA Karen called 911 on my wife, then panicked when the sheriff showed respect. Entitled People. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Maple Grove Drive as I sipped my coffee and watched the neighborhood come to life. From my living room window, I could see Mrs. Henderson walking her ancient golden retriever, the Martinez kids waiting for their school bus, and the familiar figure of Patricia Brennan making her rounds with that ever-present clipboard clutched in her manicured hands. Patricia Brennan. Even thinking her name made my jaw tighten. At 52, she carried herself with the kind of artificial authority that comes from years of unchallenged power in a small domain. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her makeup flawless even at 7 in the morning, and her clothes pressed to military precision. She'd been the Homeowners Association president for 8 long years, and in her mind, every blade of grass, every mailbox, every decorative stone in our neighborhood existed solely for her approval. "She's at it again," I muttered, watching Patricia stop in front of the Johnson house to take photographs of their newly planted rose bushes. My wife Maria looked up from her easel where she'd been working on a watercolor painting of our backyard garden. Even after 30 years of marriage, she still took my breath away. Her dark hair was streaked with silver now, and laugh lines had settled around her warm brown eyes, but she remained the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Her Colombian accent had softened over the decades but never disappeared entirely, adding a musical quality to her voice that I never tired of hearing. "What is she doing now, mi amor?" Maria asked, setting down her brush. "Documenting the Johnsons' crime of planting flowers without prior HOA approval, I imagine," I replied, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Maria shook her head sadly. "That woman carries so much anger. I wonder what happened to make her so controlling." That was my Maria, always looking for the good in people, even those who didn't deserve it. After 20 years of volunteering with the Sheriff's Department's community outreach program, she'd seen humanity at its worst and somehow managed to maintain her faith in people's fundamental goodness. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and also one of the things that worried me most in our current situation. We'd moved to Maple Grove 6 months earlier, right after my retirement from 35 years with the Sheriff's Department. The last 15 of those years, I'd served as a detective in the Major Crimes Unit. I'd seen enough violence, enough cruelty, enough of the darkness that people were capable of to fill several lifetimes. All I wanted was peace. A quiet house with a garden where Maria could paint and maybe grow some of the herbs she remembered from her childhood in Colombia. Weekend barbecues with neighbors who might become friends. Simple pleasures after a career spent swimming in other people's worst moments. We'd chosen this neighborhood specifically because it seemed perfect for that kind of retirement. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, families who'd lived here for generations. The real estate agent had mentioned the HOA almost as an afterthought, describing it as very active in maintaining property values. What she hadn't mentioned was that the HOA was essentially a one-woman dictatorship run by someone who'd confused being a neighborhood volunteer with being a feudal lord. Chapter 2, The Harassment Begins. Our first encounter with Patricia came just 2 weeks after we'd moved in. I was in the garage, unpacking boxes, and setting up my workshop, when I heard Maria's voice from the front yard. She was speaking to someone in that carefully polite tone she used when she was trying to be diplomatic. "I understand your concern," Maria was saying. "Perhaps we can find a compromise." I walked to the front door to find Patricia standing on our driveway, her hands on her hips, looking at our mailbox with the expression of someone who'd discovered a dead animal on their doorstep. "There's no compromise when it comes to neighborhood standards," Patricia was saying, her voice sharp with authority. "This mailbox is clearly not the approved shade of black. It's more of a charcoal gray, which is completely unacceptable." I looked at our mailbox, the exact same mailbox that had been there when we'd bought the house 3 months earlier. The same mailbox that had presumably been acceptable to the HOA when the previous owners lived here. "Ma'am," I said, stepping forward, "that's the same mailbox that was here when we bought the house. If it was a problem, wouldn't someone have mentioned it during the inspection?" Patricia turned to me with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, you must be the new husband. I'm Patricia Brennan, HOA president. And while the previous owners may have been lax in their adherence to community standards, I run a much tighter ship now." She pulled out a laminated card from her clipboard. "According to Section 4.2 of the HOA bylaws, all mailboxes must be painted in Benjamin Moore's onyx black specifically. Your mailbox is clearly a different shade." Maria looked at me with confusion. "But Señora, we have not painted anything. This is how we found it." "That's not my problem," Patricia replied curtly. You have 30 days to correct this violation or face a fine of $50 per day until compliance is achieved. She handed Maria a formal notice, her smile never wavering. Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm sure once you understand how things work here, we'll get along just fine. After she left, Maria and I stood in our driveway, staring at the notice. This is about a mailbox? Maria asked, bewildered. I think this is about much more than a mailbox, I replied, watching Patricia's retreating figure. 25 years of police work had taught me to recognize bullies, and Patricia Brennan was a textbook example. The only question was whether she was the type who would back down when confronted, or the type who would escalate. Over the next few weeks, I got my answer. Chapter 3, The campaign intensifies. Patricia's harassment of Maria became a daily occurrence. Every morning, like clockwork, she would make her rounds past our house, notepad in hand, searching for violations. She photographed our property from every conceivable angle. She measured the height of our grass with a ruler. She documented the exact placement of our decorative stones. The violations notices began arriving with increasing frequency. Our grass was a quarter-inch too tall. Maria's bird feeder might attract rodents. Our garden gnome was not an approved outdoor decoration. The American flag we'd hung by our front door was the wrong size according to some obscure subsection of the HOA bylaws. Maria, bless her heart, handled each complaint with her characteristic grace. She'd smile, thank Patricia for the feedback, and make whatever minor adjustment was demanded. She shortened the grass, moved the bird feeder, painted the mailbox, replaced the garden gnome with an approved garden stone. She's testing us, I told Maria one evening as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She wants to see how far she can push before we push back. Maria sipped her tea thoughtfully. In Colombia, we have a saying, El río que no suena no leva agua, the river that makes no sound carries no water. Sometimes the loudest people are the most empty inside. Maybe so, I replied, but empty people can still cause a lot of damage. I wanted to confront Patricia directly, to use some of the intimidation techniques I'd learned over 3 decades of dealing with criminals and bullies. But Maria had asked me to let her handle things her way, and I respected that. She'd dealt with difficult people before during her volunteer work with domestic violence victims and community outreach programs. If anyone could find a peaceful solution, it was her. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that Patricia wasn't interested in peaceful solutions. She was interested in power, in control, in making an example of anyone who dared to be different in her perfect little kingdom. The campaign reached new heights when Maria decided to paint a mural on our backyard wall. It was a beautiful piece, a vibrant scene of mountains and butterflies that reminded her of her childhood home in the Colombian countryside. She'd gotten all the proper permits from the city, had the work approved by the Architectural Review Board, and had even consulted with a local artist to ensure the paint wouldn't cause any damage to the wall. But Patricia didn't care about actual legality. She cared about control. Chapter 4, The Mural Incident. I was in the kitchen making my morning coffee when I heard Patricia's shrill voice from the backyard. Through the window, I could see Maria adding finishing touches to her mural, humming softly as she worked. The painting was nearly complete, a stunning landscape of rolling green hills dotted with wildflowers, butterflies dancing in the foreground, and snow-capped mountains in the distance. It was like looking through a window into Maria's memories. Patricia had somehow let herself through our side gate and was standing there, hands on hips, her face flushed red with indignation. "This is completely unacceptable," she was shrieking. "You cannot just deface property in this neighborhood. Do you have any idea what this will do to property values?" Maria continued painting, occasionally nodding and saying things like, "I understand your concern, and thank you for sharing your opinion." Her voice remained calm, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Are you even listening to me?" Patricia demanded, stepping closer to the wall. This graffiti has to go. Immediately." "It is not graffiti, Señora," Maria replied gently. "It is art. And I have all the proper permits from the city." "I don't care about city permits," Patricia screamed. "I care about neighborhood standards. This is gang-related vandalism, and I won't stand for it." That's when I knew I should go outside. Calling Maria's beautiful mural gang-related vandalism was not just insulting, it was racist. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard Patricia's voice change, becoming high-pitched and panicked. She was on the phone with 911. "Yes, I need police immediately," she was saying. There's vandalism in progress at 1247 Maple Grove Drive. A woman is spray painting gang symbols on a wall. She's Hispanic, and I feel threatened. She might be armed. I felt my blood pressure spike. Maria wasn't spray painting, she was using brushes and acrylic paints. There were no gang symbols, just mountains and butterflies. And the suggestion that my wife might be armed was so ridiculous it would have been funny if it weren't so dangerous. But I forced myself to stay inside. Maria had made me promise to let her handle things her way, and I was trying to respect that. Still, my hand moved instinctively to where my service weapon used to be before I remembered I was retired now. Through the window, I watched Patricia continue her performance for the 911 dispatcher, her voice growing more frantic with each word. She was claiming there was a dangerous situation developing, that she was in fear for her safety, and that immediate response was required. Maria, meanwhile, calmly set down her brush and began washing her hands in the small bucket of water she'd brought outside. She looked up at Patricia with the kind of patient expression she used to wear when dealing with scared children at the community center. "Senora Patricia," she said softly, "why don't you come inside? I'll make you some coffee, and we can discuss this calmly." But Patricia was beyond reasoning. She was high on her own sense of power, convinced that she was finally going to put this uppity immigrant woman in her place. She paced around our backyard, continuing her hysterical phone call, occasionally pointing at the mural as if it were evidence of a crime. Within 10 minutes, I heard the first siren. Then another. Then another. Through the front window, I watched 3 sheriff's department cruisers pull up to our house. Patricia rushed around to the front yard, practically vibrating with excitement. This was her moment of triumph, her chance to show everyone in the neighborhood what happened when you crossed Patricia Brennan. But then something happened that wiped that satisfied smirk right off her face. Chapter 5, the sheriff arrives. The lead cruiser's door opened, and instead of some rookie deputy, Sheriff Tom Harrison himself stepped out. At 60, Tom was a weathered man with gray hair and kind eyes who'd served in law enforcement for nearly 40 years. He'd been my commanding officer for the last 10 years of my career, and more importantly, he'd been a friend of our family for over 2 decades. Tom removed his hat, glanced at Patricia with mild interest, and then walked right past her toward our backyard. I watched from the window as his weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "Maria," he called out, opening his arms wide. My wife rushed toward him and embraced him like the old friend he was. Patricia's jaw literally dropped. I could see the exact moment her brain short-circuited, trying to process what she was witnessing. The woman she'd just called 911 on was hugging the county sheriff like family. And in a way, she was. Let me explain the history here. 22 years ago, Tom's teenage daughter Sarah had been the victim of a stalking incident. A classmate had become obsessed with her, following her home from school, leaving disturbing notes in her locker, and escalating to the point where the family feared for her safety. The legal system could only do so much, but Tom knew his daughter needed practical skills to protect herself. That's when he'd met Maria. She'd been volunteering with the sheriff's department's community outreach program, teaching self-defense classes to women and girls. Maria had worked with Sarah for months, not just teaching her physical techniques but helping her build confidence and overcome the fear that had begun to dominate her life. When Sarah graduated from high school the following year, she credited Maria with giving her back her sense of safety and self-worth. Tom had never forgotten that kindness, and over the years, Maria had become like a second mother to his daughter. But that was just the beginning of Maria's relationship with the sheriff's department. Over the next 2 decades, she'd volunteered countless hours with the Domestic Violence Advocacy Program, helping victims navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. She'd organized art therapy sessions for traumatized children. She'd taught English classes to immigrant families. She'd mentored young deputies and helped them understand how to work effectively with diverse communities. Half the deputies on the force considered her family. The other half considered her a saint. So when Patricia had called 911 claiming there was a dangerous Hispanic woman causing problems in the neighborhood, the dispatcher had immediately recognized our address. Within minutes, every deputy in the area knew that someone was harassing Maria Rodriguez, the woman who'd probably done more good for their community than any other civilian they knew. Chapter 6, Justice Served. Tom listened patiently as Patricia rushed over to him, words tumbling out of her mouth about the dangerous situation and the immediate need for action. She gestured wildly at the mural, calling it gang graffiti and vandalism, claiming she felt threatened and unsafe. Tom's expression never changed. He nodded occasionally, his weathered face giving nothing away. Then he walked over to examine the mural more closely. "This is beautiful, Maria," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "It reminds me of those paintings you used to show Sarah when she was learning about different cultures in your art classes." He turned back to Patricia with the kind of disappointed look that had made hardened criminals confess to crimes they hadn't even been accused of yet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service, "this woman has every right to paint her own wall. She has proper permits from the city, which I can see posted right there by her back door. More importantly, calling 911 for a non-emergency like this is a misuse of emergency services." Patricia tried to sputter out excuses, but Tom wasn't finished. "I understand this isn't your first call about Mrs. Rodriguez," he continued, pulling out a small notebook. "According to our records, you've made 17 calls to 911 about this address in the past 4 months. Every single call was for a non-emergency situation. Most of them were for what you described as suspicious activity that turned out to be Mrs. Rodriguez gardening, getting her mail, or walking her neighbor's dog while they were out of town." Patricia's face went from red to white. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. These people, they're not like us." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Patricia seemed to realize she'd said too much. Tom closed his notebook and looked at Patricia with the kind of expression he usually reserved for people who just confessed to particularly heinous crimes. "Ma'am, I've known Maria Rodriguez for over 20 years. She's taught my daughter self-defense, helped dozens of domestic violence victims through our advocacy program, and volunteered more hours with this department than some of our paid employees. If there's anyone in this neighborhood who's not like us, it's not her." By now, the other deputies had arrived and were taking notes. Deputy Rodriguez, who Maria had helped through a difficult divorce and custody battle, looked particularly disgusted. Deputy Chen, whose twin daughters had attended Maria's free art classes at the community center, was shaking her head sadly. Tom informed Patricia that filing false police reports was a crime, that using emergency services to harass neighbors based on their ethnicity was a serious matter, and that there would be a full investigation into all her previous calls. Patricia's face went through several color changes, red to white to green, in the span of seconds. She tried to backtrack, claiming she genuinely felt threatened, that she was just trying to protect the neighborhood, that she'd been misunderstood. But every deputy there had seen this song and dance before. They knew harassment when they saw it, and they knew racism when they heard it. Chapter 7, The investigation. Over the next few weeks, Detective Sarah Mills, Tom's daughter, now grown and working in the sheriff's department herself, led an investigation into Patricia's abuse of power. What they found was even worse than I'd imagined. In her 8 years as HOA president, Patricia had filed 47 complaints against various neighbors. When Sarah mapped out the complaints, a clear pattern emerged: 73% of them targeted people of color, recent immigrants, or anyone else Patricia deemed didn't fit her vision of the perfect neighbor. The elderly Chen couple 2 streets over had been fined repeatedly for their non-conforming vegetable garden, despite the fact that gardens were explicitly allowed under HOA rules. Patricia had claimed their bok choy and bitter melon were weeds and demanded they be removed. The young Rodriguez family near the park had been visited by police 6 times after Patricia called in noise complaints about their children's birthday parties. Every single party had been held during approved hours with appropriate permits, but Patricia had described them as gang gatherings and public disturbances. Most heartbreaking was the story of the elderly Wilson couple. When Mr. Wilson had suffered a stroke and needed a wheelchair, his wife had installed a ramp to help him get into their house. Patricia had immediately cited them for an unauthorized modification and demanded they remove it. When they'd explained the medical necessity, she'd offered to consider an exception for a fee of $500, money the couple couldn't afford on their fixed income. The investigation also revealed that Patricia had been systematically violating HOA bylaws herself. She'd imposed fines without proper board votes, pocketed HOA funds for personal expenses, and made unilateral decisions that required community approval. She'd essentially turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, ruling through intimidation and fear. But perhaps most damaging was the discovery that Patricia had been using her position to drive out residents she didn't like, then purchasing their homes at below-market prices through a shell company. She'd been buying low and selling high, using the HOA as a tool for her own financial gain. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. As word of the investigation spread through the neighborhood, something remarkable happened. People who'd been too intimidated to speak up before suddenly found their voices. stories poured out about Patricia's tactics, her threats, her manipulation. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman with the golden retriever, revealed that Patricia had tried to ban her from walking her dog past certain houses because the dog was too large and intimidating. The Martinez family shared how Patricia had called immigration services on them despite the fact that they were third-generation American citizens. The Johnson family, whose rose bushes had been photographed that morning so many months ago, described how Patricia had demanded they pay for a landscape consultation with her preferred contractor before making any changes to their yard. The nice gay couple who lived at the end of the street had been subjected to months of harassment disguised as concerned neighbor visits. Patricia had made increasingly intrusive inquiries about their lifestyle choices and had suggested they might be more comfortable in a different neighborhood. An emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Saturday. The community center was packed, the largest turnout in the neighborhood's history. Patricia showed up in a power suit, clearly expecting to talk her way out of trouble. She'd prepared a presentation about misunderstandings and miscommunications, complete with charts and graphs showing how property values had increased during her tenure. She'd underestimated how fed up everyone had become. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories. The room filled with accounts of harassment, intimidation, and discrimination. Patricia's face grew paler with each testimony, her prepared talking points becoming increasingly irrelevant. When it came time for the vote, the result was unanimous. Patricia Brennan was removed from the HOA board, effective immediately. She was also banned from ever serving on the board again, and a formal complaint was filed with the State Attorney General's office regarding her financial misconduct. But that still wasn't the end of Patricia's troubles. Chapter 9, Legal Consequences. The District Attorney's Office, after reviewing the evidence compiled by Detective Mills, decided to prosecute Patricia for her pattern of abusing emergency services. The charges were serious: 3 counts of filing false police reports, 2 counts of misuse of emergency services, and 1 count of harassment based on ethnicity. Each count carried potential jail time and heavy fines. More importantly, a conviction would destroy Patricia's real estate license and end the career she'd built over 15 years. The trial was a media sensation. Local newspapers picked up the story of the HOA president who cried wolf, and it quickly went viral on social media. Patricia became a symbol of everything wrong with overzealous neighborhood associations and casual racism disguised as community standards. During the trial, Maria testified with her usual grace and dignity. She didn't ask for the maximum punishment, just for Patricia to understand the harm she'd caused and to get help for whatever drove her need to control others. "I believe that hurt people," Maria said from the witness stand. Perhaps if Patricia can understand why she felt the need to attack others, she can learn to be a better neighbor and a better person. Other neighbors testified about the climate of fear Patricia had created. Deputy Chen spoke about the waste of police resources and the danger of false emergency calls. Detective Mills presented evidence of the financial fraud and the pattern of discriminatory harassment. Patricia's lawyer tried to argue that she'd been genuinely concerned about neighborhood safety, that cultural misunderstandings had led to the complaints, that she'd never intended to harm anyone. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern was undeniable. Judge Williams, a no-nonsense woman who'd seen every excuse in the book, wasn't buying it. Chapter 10, The Sentence. 3 months after the trial began, Patricia stood before Judge Williams for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, deputies, and members of the Latino community who'd been following the case. Judge Williams had clearly done her homework. She'd read every police report, every complaint, every piece of evidence. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years on the bench dealing with cases exactly like this one. "Ms. Brennan," she began, "you held a position of trust in your community. You were elected to serve your neighbors, to help maintain property values and community standards. Instead, you used that position to harass, intimidate, and discriminate against people who looked different from you or came from different backgrounds." Patricia stood silently, tears streaming down her face. "Your actions wasted thousands of dollars in police resources," Judge Williams continued. "You created a climate of fear in your neighborhood. You turned emergency services into a weapon against people you didn't like. This behavior is not only illegal, it's dangerous." The judge sentenced Patricia to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service specifically working with immigrant rights organizations, and $20,000 in fines to cover the cost of the wasted emergency responses. She was also ordered to attend counseling to address her underlying prejudices and control issues. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the loss of her real estate license. When the state licensing board learned about her convictions, they revoked her license permanently. The career she'd built over 15 years was gone. Patricia's face crumbled as the judge read the sentence. For the first time, she seemed to understand that her reign of terror had real consequences. Chapter 11, New Beginnings. In the months that followed, our neighborhood slowly healed. A new HOA board was elected, with representatives from every street and a commitment to actual community building rather than authoritarian control. The new president was Mrs. Chen, whose gentle leadership style was the polar opposite of Patricia's iron fist. Maria finished her mural, and it became a neighborhood landmark. People would walk by just to admire it, and Maria started offering painting classes in our backyard for anyone interested. Children who'd been afraid to play outside during Patricia's reign began filling the streets again, their laughter replacing the previous atmosphere of fear. The Wilson couple got their wheelchair ramp officially approved and received a formal apology from the new HOA board. The Rodriguez family started hosting larger parties, confident they wouldn't be harassed. The Chin family expanded their garden, sharing vegetables with neighbors who'd never tasted bok choy before. As for Patricia, she served her community service working with a local immigrant rights organization. I heard through the grapevine that the work was humbling for her, that she was slowly beginning to understand the human cost of her actions. Whether she would truly change or just learn to hide her prejudices better remained to be seen. Maria, being Maria, actually advocated for Patricia during her sentencing hearing. She asked the judge to consider rehabilitation rather than just punishment, to give Patricia a chance to become a better person. Even after everything she'd been put through, my wife chose compassion over revenge. Chapter 12, Reflection. One evening, about a year after the whole ordeal began, Maria and I were sitting on our back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The mural on our wall seemed to glow in the fading light, and I could hear children playing in the street, a sound that had been absent during Patricia's reign. "Do you think she learned anything?" I asked, thinking about Patricia's community service. Maria considered the question carefully, as she always did. "I think she learned that actions have consequences," she said finally. "Whether she learned why her actions were wrong, that's harder to say." "Any regrets about how we handled it?" "No," Maria said firmly. "We gave her every opportunity to be reasonable. We tried to be good neighbors. But sometimes, people mistake kindness for weakness. Sometimes, you have to stand up to bullies." I looked at my wife, this woman who'd faced down a neighborhood tyrant with nothing but grace and dignity, and felt the same surge of pride I'd felt the day I watched her embrace Tom in our backyard. "I'm proud of you," I said. "You handled the whole thing better than I would have." Maria smiled and took my hand. "We handled it together, mi amor. That's what partners do." As we sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of our neighborhood returning to life, I reflected on what we'd learned. Patricia had been right about one thing: actions do have consequences. But she'd forgotten that kindness has consequences too. Maria's years of volunteer work, her gentle treatment of everyone she met, her willingness to see the good in people, all of that had built a network of relationships that protected us when we needed it most. The sheriff who'd embraced my wife in our backyard, the deputies who'd been disgusted by Patricia's behavior, the neighbors who'd finally found their voices, they'd all been touched by Maria's kindness at some point. When the time came, they'd been ready to stand up for her. Patricia had built her power on fear and intimidation. Maria had built her influence on love and service. In the end, love won. Epilogue. 2 years later, 2 years after Patricia's sentencing, I was working in my garden when I heard a familiar voice from the street. I looked up to see Patricia walking by with an elderly Latino man, helping him carry groceries to his house. She was thinner than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, and her face had lost that hard edge that had defined her for so long. She saw me watching and stopped. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then she walked over to our fence. "I wanted to thank your wife," she said quietly. "For what she said at my sentencing. About giving me a chance to become a better person." I nodded, not sure what to say. "I'm working with the Immigrant Services Center now," she continued. It's opened my eyes to a lot of things. I was wrong about so much." "Maria always believed people could change," I said. "She'd be glad to know you're trying." Patricia nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm trying to do better. To be better." She walked away then, continuing to help the elderly man with his groceries. I watched her go, thinking about second chances and the possibility of redemption. That evening, I told Maria about the encounter. She listened with her characteristic patience, then smiled. "See," she said. "I told you people could change." And in that moment, watching my wife's face light up with hope for someone who'd caused us so much pain, I was reminded once again why I'd fallen in love with her all those years ago. Some people build walls. Others build bridges. Maria had always been a bridge builder, and even in our retirement, she was still connecting people, still believing in the possibility of understanding and forgiveness. Our neighborhood had become the peaceful place we'd hoped for when we'd first moved to Maple Grove Drive. But more than that, it had become a community, one where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where kindness was valued over conformity, and where everyone truly was welcome. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd step out onto our back porch and look at Maria's mural glowing in the moonlight. Mountains and butterflies, memories of a homeland transformed into art that brought joy to everyone who saw it. It was a perfect metaphor for my wife, someone who took the best parts of her past and shared them with the world, making everything a little more beautiful in the process. The sheriff's wife had won, not through force or intimidation, but through the quiet power of love and justice working hand in hand. And in a world that often seemed dominated by people like Patricia, that victory felt nothing short of miraculous.